So, learning about color theory is all well and good, but unless you're actually practicing what you learn, it's going to be super hard to retain that information. The issue that I find is, what kind of exercises should you be doing, and how many of these, and for how long? In the past, I'd literally just go online, find a reference, and then spend hours and hours just copying it and painting it literally one-to-one. So rather than going down that route, I've decided to make this video to show you some effective ways of studying for your own learning. This video is also complementary to my art analysis of Stray, and we're going to be doing 3 color studies based off what I talked about in that one. So, first things first, what is a color study? So at its core, a color study is just a very short and small painting that we're doing focusing on colors. That's literally it. Because of this, we're actually going to ignore some of the other fundamentals like perspective and design and texture and things like that. Okay, so I've got my 3 different references here, and as you can see, I've split them down based off of the type of palette being used. So the first one here at the start of the game is monochromatic. You can see that there's basically just one color being used, a couple of accents here, but everything's just that singular blue. The second one is complementary. We have green at the top and then red at the bottom, which creates a lot of these interesting halftone shapes and colors that we're going to be exploring more. And then finally we have triadic. So the main colors here are cyan and yellow. To make it triadic, you would have to add a bit of pink and purple. Of course, in Clementine's bathroom, there's a lot of pink being used, which kind of fits the palette anyway. What I'm going to be doing is adding in a purple light source at the bottom to kind of tie everything together. Oh, and also one thing I highly recommend when you do start to do your color studies, I definitely recommend setting a time limit. Just like figure drawing, we're not perfectly rendering each pose every single time, but we're just trying to gain the overall essence of it. And of course, it goes without saying, during this entire painting process, do not color pick anything. I'm watching you. Seriously. So as I begin my first color study, I'm going to be starting the exact same way each time. The first thing I'm doing is just very lightly sketching in the rough proportions of my image. Again, I'm not thinking about things like composition or balance, I'm literally just copying what I see from my reference. The second step that I do is pick a kind of base color that all of the other colors will follow. So we do that because colors are relative and having a dominant color will limit our palettes and what we choose. I want you to think of this like having a strong foundation for a home, so you need a good base for everything else to be built off of. A huge tip is that for environment painting specifically, this dominant color is usually determined by the sky. In this example, I'm picking a mid-tone blue and something not too saturated and kind of laying everything down. After that, I'm starting to block in other buildings by choosing darker and slightly more saturated versions of this blue. Because the color palette is monochromatic, I'm not shifting my hue slider that much, and I'm kind of just staying within the blue zone. The main thing at this stage that I'm focusing on is just getting the overall tones and values down. During this entire process, I'm thinking about things like, how light is this thing compared to this other thing? How dark is this thing? And constantly just referring to my reference the entire time. Again, at this stage, the reference is very key, so just kind of use that as your guide for the entire painting process. I will say though, something that you can do to build your intuition and to check if your colors are right is to simply split your workspace like this. So the idea is you have your reference on one side and then your color study on the other. The reason I don't recommend having your reference on a second monitor is because sometimes the colors can be different from one monitor to your drawing tablet. In that case, the colors that you pick aren't going to be exactly what you see, so it's better to have it all on the one screen. Here's my actual setup, and as you can see, the colors on my drawing tablet are ever so slightly different to my monitor, so my color choices may not actually be the same as what I'm seeing. When it comes to editing, I'm using a lot of the lasso tool to create my shapes to keep everything nice and blocky. I'm not really blending things that much. This is deliberate to force me to be a little bit more intentional with my choices, because I can't just hide behind my blending. After this, I start to detail and imply some of the texture from the buildings by simply just drawing them in. It's just things like visual noise, so pipes, bricks, and other things can be represented by just a few strokes. Here's the important part. If I was actually going to paint this properly, I would take the time to make sure all of the materials look good, all of the textures are in place, things like bricks, we don't want to miss out on stuff like that. But in this case, because it's a color study, who cares? One of the major advantages of working digitally is you don't have to be super accurate with your color selections all the time. Another tip with color studies is that the major advantage of working digitally is you don't have to nail the colors every single time. So for example, if you're painting your color study and you notice that the colors are a little bit different or could be improved, you can just use things like the hue and saturation slider or the curves modifier as well. After all, at the end of the day, we're all human, so we're gonna make mistakes and we're not gonna be perfect every single time. But I tell you, if you color pick, you're dead to me. And here is the reference versus my final color study. In our next study, we're going to step things up in difficulty by introducing another color. In this entire section of Stray, we see red and green being used, which are both complementary colors. Once again, I start off with my line art block in and then paint the background with green at the top and red on the bottom. Since there's no singular dominant color here like the previous example, I'm kind of treating the sky as having two color zones, so green on the top and red on the bottom. Now I'm gonna be real, this one here stumped me a little while because I wasn't actually sure how to go about picking my colors for this one, and it was kind of overwhelming since there was so much stuff going on. But I took things slow and started off with the main buildings. An important thing to note is that an object can have multiple colors over it, especially with things like light fall off. In this case, the buildings had a mixture of both red and green, and to quickly block that in, I just used an airbrush. With my red and green color zones established, I then started picking colors based off of this hue and temperature. So for example, the shadows in the red sections are a little bit red, and the shadows in the green section are a little bit green, though it does depend on your lighting setup. You may have also noticed that I'm staying quite zoomed out of this entire process, and that's on purpose so I can see the entire image at once. Now, I don't remember where I heard this art quote from, but it's something along the lines of work small to solve big problems and work big to solve small problems. So that saying kind of just refers to the size of your canvas and how working small can solve the big fundamental problems of your image. Once again, I'm keeping my color choices quite strict and not choosing anything apart from red and green. When doing the study, something super cool I noticed is all of the planes facing upward were green and all of the ones facing down were red. This reinforces the lighting of the scene and is a cool trick we can use to implement in our own art. And the cool thing about doing studies is that you actually start to make a lot of observations like this. So when I started thinking, okay, why are all the planes that face upward green? The answer is, it's because of all the green in the atmosphere. Similarly, all of the ones that are red facing downward are because of the strong light source coming from beneath. And for the complementary color palette, here is my reference versus the final. And last but not least, we're going to be painting Clementine's apartment, which has three major colors of cyan, purple, and yellow, which is a triadic color scheme. Once again, we start off simply with the sketch and the basic block-in. Now at this stage, since it's an interior, the dominant color in this section is just obviously going to be that cyan from the window. I'm really trying to get that in as quickly as possible and then slowly introduce my other colors. In my reference, you're going to notice that there's a lot of overlapping shapes here. So each one of these crystals or lights gets its own layer. I then start introducing all of the other elements and furniture here. I'm thinking less about the shapes and more about the colors that I see on them. The shadows in this painting are a little bit warmer here in temperature, which also helps to add to that cozy feeling. Apart from the cyan window, the strongest light sources in this image are the bottom lamp over here and also that pink crystal that I added in. I wanted to introduce a little bit of that purple because, as I mentioned earlier, we do see it in Clementine's bathroom, and I thought it'd be cool to kind of introduce another cool light source in this image. After that, I'm just kind of taking my time and detailing things as I notice them in my reference image. The important part of this section here is I want you to start thinking a little bit more about your own practice when it comes to art. So rather than starting off with the most complicated reference image I could find, I decided to start small and had these little kind of training wheels and then gradually increase the complexity as I got better. And overall, here are some takeaways I'd like to leave you with color studies. Number 1, who cares about proportions and perspective? You can trace over your references for the proportions, but you really want to jump straight into coloring. Don't spend time doing things that are super irrelevant. If you're doing a perspective study, then of course this is going to be important, but if it's just colors, remove the barrier of entry and just jump straight in. Number 2, start with the biggest or most dominant color first, and if the image has several colors, break them up into different zones. For example, red or green, and then pick colors based off of them. Number 3, I find it easiest first to start with shadows to block in form and lighting, and then add all the highlights on top. Number 4, stay zoomed out as much as possible for very complicated scenes, because you want to capture the overall essence and not the details. And number 5, and the biggest and most crucial part of studies I think, is keeping a time limit. While you shouldn't rush, don't go overboard and turn everything into a full finished portfolio piece like I did and call it a study. And not to blame anything, but a lot of what I would see online as a student were like these beautiful finished paintings that had all of this detail, and then the person that posted it would slap in like launch sketch as the title. Oh my lord, I can't believe how frustrating this was to see all of the time, because it's like, dude, you have like 3 hours for lunch? What do you mean lunch sketch? I don't get it. So the whole point is, when you do color studies, take your time, but set the time limit here, because you don't want to go over like 2 or 3 hours or whatever. Just get what you can from learning, move on to the next one. That's all it should be. And that's really like the main motivation of me wanting to make this video. And finally, for the triadic color scheme, here is my reference versus the final. Once again, if you have any questions or you'd like me to go in more detail about anything, let me know in the comments down below. The next video that's going to follow up from this one is not a color study. It's still going to be in the world of Stray, but I'm going to be doing a full illustration and kind of walking you through the process with my little original robot Wyatt as well. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care and stay safe.